So, a very good afternoon to all of you who are present here. On behalf of the Department of English and Modern European Languages, University of Allahabad, I extend my warm welcome to the distinguished speaker, to all the faculty members who are here, research scholars, students, and all the other participants who have joined for this first session of this international workshop, Contemporary Horizons of Comparative Literature. So this 5-day academic program has been conceived as a platform for engaging with the evolving methods, debates, and interdisciplinary possibilities of comparative literature in the contemporary world. Comparative literature today is no longer confined to the study of influences between national literatures. It has grown into a dynamic field that examines literary relations across languages, cultures, histories, media, and intellectual traditions. It encourages us to cross boundaries, question fixed categories, and rethink literature in relation to translation, world literature, decoloniality, and the wider humanities. Comparative literature is one of the most vital ways of understanding cultural interconnectedness in our rapidly changing world. So today we are deeply honored to have Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanick, who is Associate Professor at the Center for Indian Languages, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is former Assistant Professor at the Department of Comparative Indian Languages and Literature, University of Calcutta. He has numerous publications and presentations to his credit. And most significantly, he was a recipient of the very prestigious Sahitya Akademi Award for Translation in 2023, the Charles Wallace India Trust Translation Fellowship in 2025, and also recently the A.K. Ramanujan Prize this year in 2026. So this evening, he will deliver his lecture titled, Does Crisis Complement the Comparative? A very interesting title. It touches a central debate in the history of comparative literature, whether moments of crisis are signs of decline or opportunities for renewal and intellectual transformation. We are certain that his insights will open important avenues of reflection for all of us. So now I would invite the head of the department, Professor Indrani Mukherjee, who has been very supportive towards this event, to welcome the resource person. Ma'am, kindly unmute yourself. I think you are muted.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am, you are audible now. You are muted. Now it's okay. Now it's okay, ma'am. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all the participants joining us today. I'm extremely pleased to welcome our distinguished guest speaker for today's session, Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanick, a Sahitya Akademi Awardee from the Center of Indian Languages at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. It is an honor for our institution to host you once again, sir, for this international online workshop. This kind of academic event offers a unique blend of global collaboration, interdisciplinary study, and scholarly exchange, which is extremely significant for cross-cultural dialogue and innovative methodologies. I would like to congratulate Dr. Aloysius Sebastian for initiating this online format, which facilitates both accessibility and inclusivity. This workshop is a sequel to the online lecture series on comparative literature organized by the Department of English and Modern European Languages. And I'm very sure that Dr. Pramanik's talk on does crisis complement the comparative will be very relevant in terms of addressing the core theoretical challenges in the discipline and also exploring new comparative paradigms that redefine its boundaries and critical perspectives. So now, without taking any more time, I would like to invite Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanick as we look forward to a very interesting, informative, and engaging session ahead. Dr. Pramanick.
Sir, you are
Thank you.
on mute.
Yeah.
Just a moment, sir. Swati, please introduce Professor Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanick to the audience. So,
Good evening, everyone. I'm Swati Das, a research scholar in the Department of English and Modern European Languages, University of Allahabad. On the behalf of the department, I extend a warm welcome to everyone present here for our today's session of our online international workshop on contemporary horizons of comparative literature. It is truly a matter of great privilege and a pleasure that we get to welcome our distinguished resource person for this session, Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanick. Before I formally introduce him, I would like to take a brief moment to acknowledge the constant support and guidance of our respected Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Sangeeta Srivastav ma'am, our esteemed Head of Department, Professor Indrani Mukherjee ma'am, and our dedicated coordinator, Dr. Aloysius Sebastian sir, whose efforts have made this lecture series possible and meaningful. I would also like to begin on a slight personal and reflective note that Dr. Pramanick has been associated with this lecture series from the very beginning. We remember his previous session with great appreciation. The student found it extremely engaging and intellectually enriching, and it left a lasting impression on all of us. So we are delighted to have him with us once again. Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanick is currently serving as an associate professor at the Center of Indian Languages, School of Language, Literature and Cultural Studies, JNU. He has previously taught as an assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Indian Language and Literature at the University of Calcutta. He is also the founder coordinator of the Center for Translation and Literary Geography. His areas of scholarship include translation studies, language and community, migration and refugee studies, border studies, and Dalit literature. Dr. Pramanick has published, edited, and translated 11 books, along with several articles in reputed journals. He is the recipient of prestigious Sahitya Akademi Award for translation in 2023, awarded by the Government of India. He also received the Charles Wallace India Trust Translation Fellowship in 2025 at the British Centre for Literary Translation, University of East Anglia, UK. And most recently, he has been honored with the A.K. Ramanujan Prize for Translation by the Association for Asian Studies, Canada. Today, he will be delivering his lecture on a very interesting and thought-provoking topic: does crisis complement the comparative? With this, I once again extend a heartfelt welcome to you, sir. We are truly honored to have you with us, and we look forward to your lecture. Thank you, and over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Swati, for this generous introduction. Thank you, Indrani ma'am, Professor Indrani Mukherjee, for giving me another opportunity to talk to the students of Allahabad University. And my special thanks to Aloysius. Aloysius is my student, my friend, and he is very sincerely he is contributing to the field, and uh, the very idea of this international workshop is unique and necessary, because we know that National Education Policy 2020 also focuses on comparative literature and translation studies. And Allahabad University English and Foreign Language Department is continuously organizing workshops, seminars on comparative literature and translation. So this is personally very happy moment for me, being a student of comparative literature and translation studies. So today I will be talking on the crisis of comparative literature, and those who practice comparative literature in a discipline, they know that the comparatists survive with the idea of crisis. Without the question of crisis, there is no existence of comparative literature. And therefore, I put my title that does crisis uh, complement the comparative? The literature is omitted here. So, I mean, people will understand that literature is hidden. So, whenever we talk about crisis in comparative literature, we actually hint towards a new paradigm shift in the discipline. And when, for the first time, this question of crisis was raised by René Wellek, one of the founder theorist of the discipline, he actually talked about new paradigm shift in the discipline. We all know that comparative literature as a discipline grew up in various nations after the war. First World War, Second World War, during the time of Cold War. All the global conflicts is very much connected with the pretext of comparative literature. When Susan Bassnett wrote her most debatable and discussed, well-received book on comparative literature, he pointed out that it is a new turn after the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989. And also when Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak wrote Death of a Discipline, she also focused the Cold War, 1989 fall of Berlin Wall, and the disintegration of Soviet Union, how affected the discipline of comparative literature. When René Wellek talked about crisis of the discipline, crisis of comparative literature, it is not only the crisis of comparative literature, but it is about the crisis of literary studies in the world in general. And world means here specifically the Europe and America. So whenever comparatists talked about the crisis of comparative literature, it is particularly crisis in comparative literature, but in general, it is crisis in literary studies across the globe. René Wellek was very much disappointed about the traditional studies of literature in the West, because according to him, the traditional study of literature was mainly followed by the methodologies like historical relativism, uh, scientism, and 19th century factualism. So he argued that literary studies should come across all these boundaries, and we should focus on literariness, the very idea of literature, literary aesthetics, form, genre, and the critical analysis of literature. He and later comparatists also observed that our literary studies is going towards in more descriptive mode than analytical mode. And after intervention of cultural studies, the later great influence of Frankfurt School and other cultural theorists, we found that cultural studies tend to occupy the field of comparative literature, because other literary disciplines, those whom we call as single literature disciplines, they have their own responsibilities towards particular language. That is their responsibility, and that is also their boundaries. So there are Bangla department, Hindi department, English department, and many other literary department based on a single particular language in our country. So those literary disciplines have their own responsibilities towards the community, towards the language, towards the heritage, tradition of that particular linguistic traditions or linguistic communities. But when we talk about comparative literature, it is not particularly affiliated with any language. And comparative literature, as Aloysius mentioned in his introduction, that it always talks about transcending the border, and that border is any kind of border. It is not only the physical border, but it is also about the idea of the border, what we have between the languages, between the cultures, between the communities, between the classes and all. So comparative literature talks about transcending the borders. But what is the crisis in comparative literature? I told that whenever we talked about crisis in comparative literature, it is important for any literary scholars or any students of any literary disciplines, because the crisis of comparative literature is not only the crisis of comparative literature, but it is crisis of literary studies in general. Before the inception of the discipline of comparative literature, we were introduced with the idea of world literature. Goethe's idea of world literature in 1827, and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' intervention in about world literature in their Communist Manifesto in 1848. So the early or the traditional comparative literature has very deep connection with world literature. But in contemporary scholarship, we often argue that comparative literature is shifting towards world literature and all. But there is not much difference in the disciplinary studies of comparative literature and world literature. If we observe, we can find that most of the scholars of world literature are the comparative literature practitioners. Therefore, comparative literature has very good exchange and interchangeably occupying spaces among comparative literature, translation studies, and world literature. André Lefebvre also was very important translation studies scholars who did comparative literature very sincerely. And that happened with many other comparatists like Susan Bassnett, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. Spivak also began her career with the discipline of comparative literature. And most of the time of her career, she served comparative literature in different ways, in practice, being in the discipline, and also by her theoretical contribution. So the most of the comparative literature scholars, they are not only working on literature, but they are working on translation and the very idea of world literature. René Wellek's argument was we should focus more about the literature. And what is the crisis when we face crisis in our literary studies? That crisis are two types of crisis. One is the extra literary crisis. Another one is non-literary crisis. So what is the extra literary crisis? The crisis is actually an inability of literary response to the extra literary and non-literary affairs and devices. Extra literary elements are directly connected with literature, and non-literary elements are with indirect relationship with literary productions. So what are the extra literary elements that makes comparative literature face the crisis? Extra literary elements are different kind of methodology. I mean, the historical context, cultural context of a literary text, biographical study of an author. So all these are extra literary affairs. René Wellek's argument was that we are focusing more on the elements or issues beyond a literary text, and therefore our literary studies are becoming more descriptive. And what we should do, we should focus on the literary text, and it should be more analytical. You know that historical relativism, it talks about the truth in history is relative. It is true for particular time, particular space, and all. When we talk about scientism, it is about the concrete observation and the conclusion of truth coming from the concrete observation, and also the 19th century factualism. It is about the anthropological intervention, the colonial anthropologists' intervention in different colonial nation to collect data, fact, information, gathering those, making archives, and preparing an epistemological ground. René Wellek's argument was that literature is something else in our epistemological world, because it is not only about the fact, it is not about collecting data, information, it is not only about the historical chronology or the historical relativism, derivation of truth in particular time and space, or it is not only a scientific study of the literary content, but literature creates a different world. Literature has its own imagination, own world, own reality. Literature talks about human psychology. Literature talks about the people's relation with the time and space. That space is both psychological space and geographical space. Therefore, literature demands a different kind of study from within. So the text itself is very, very much powerful to offer us a different worldview and to construct a different world for the human imagination, because it is a collective result of human creative and cultural expression. So it was his argument that whenever we are facing crisis, it means we are facing crisis in general in our literary studies, because analytical literary studies are in lack in our discipline, and we are more focusing on descriptive studies of the discipline or descriptive studies of the literature with the help of cultural context, historical context, biography of the author and all. So all these are extra literary affair. What occupies the literary space? Occupies the literary space means the space of textual critical appreciation. And what are the non-literary affairs or non-literary devices? The non-literary affairs and non-literary devices are like the market economy, like the politics of publishing, like the politics of translation, language politics, the government policy, the policies of the institutions, and all. So all these are non-literary affairs or devices, what actually affects our literary studies. So when we started including Indian literature in English translation, in English program all across the country, it is completely dependent on the politics of the publishings, politics of the translation, politics of the representation of certain literature from certain linguistic communities. And this is how some kind of literary text become very popular or become classy, become very representative and all. But most of the languages, most of the communities are not represented when we study Indian literature through English translation. And that happens to any kind of literary corpus of any part of the world or for any linguistic community. That representation is always biased, representation is always political and partial. Therefore, all these extra literary and non-literary affairs are very important to shape our literary discipline and our literary imagination. Therefore, we face crisis in literary studies from these two perspectives. One is extra-literary, another one is non-literary. When our literature discipline fails to respond to the extra literary and non-literary conditions, we face crisis. We start finding new ways how to balance between the definition of our discipline, the very nature of our discipline, and the extra literary and non-literary affairs. If we take René Wellek's position very seriously and if we follow him, then the present or contemporary literary studies across the globe is mostly in crisis, because we tend to work more on cultural affairs, the cultural studies, related to cultural studies, or the research similar to social sciences. So literature is appeared as one of the many sources of our study. But in literary studies, literature should be one and only sources. Other methodologies or other areas of knowledge can help us to understand the literary text in better way. But instead of that, all these extra literary affairs are occupying the literary space. Therefore, René Wellek focused more on the literariness. What constructs a text as a text of literature? What is literary? What is literature? So all these things he bring into his discussion. And his essay on crisis in comparative literature is actually create a watershed, and that creates a new school of comparative literature, that is American School of Comparative Literature. Therefore, this 1948, this year is very, very important. René Etienne, another comparatist, he published one book called Crisis in Comparative Literature in 1966, almost 18 years after René Wellek. And that book is also very important because René Etienne also focused, and he was also very serious about the crisis in comparative literature. And whenever I am talking about crisis in comparative literature, it is actually the crisis in literary studies across the globe. So whenever I will talk about comparative literature in crisis, it is actually literature in crisis. So what was René Etienne's position? René Etienne began his book with the translation of crisis in comparative literature in different languages, in Japanese, in German, in Russian, in many languages. And with this representation, he tried to imply that crisis in comparative literature is a reality in all across the globe, in different countries. It is not only the European reality or the American reality. René Wellek was strong critic of French School of Comparative Literature, because we know French school mostly focused on the influence studies, and through influence studies they started to understand the connection among the nations through literary representations. René Wellek was firmly against of these influence studies. Therefore, American school talked more about interliterariness, as René Wellek talked about literariness. So they talked about interliterariness, and instead of influence studies, they talk about reception studies and all. So influence studies tend to create a kind of a hierarchy, because somebody is influenced by somebody else. Some event is influenced by another event. Some text is influenced by some other text. So there are certain hierarchies. So if we keep on studying comparative literature through the methodology of influence studies, comparative literature will be a study of literary hierarchies only, literary hierarchies across the globe. So it is not the vision or mission of comparative literature, because comparative literature as a discipline, it began to transcend the border and to break the hierarchy and to reshape the canon. Therefore, René Wellek was strong critic of French school, what actually proposed influence studies, or what was mostly tend to do influence studies. But unfortunately, what happened? Whenever we talked about comparative literature in different literary disciplines, if you take India as a case study, you can find other than comparative literature disciplines, and there are very few comparative literature departments across the country. So other than comparative literature departments, most of the departments, whenever they offer courses on comparative literature, they actually fall into this trap of influence studies. And through these influence studies, they actually try to connect the world. That is problematic. That is problematic in a sense because it creates only the hierarchy. It may connect the nations with the representation of the literatures and the literary exchanges, but it creates hierarchy. But our literary exchanges, history of our literary exchanges is not at all hierarchical, but it is about the critical appreciation of one nation, one movement, one text, one particular genre, one author, and all. And there are beautiful examples of this exchanges without hierarchy in our medieval literary history also, when we found the circulation of literary text through Silk Route, all these business route, circulation of Buddhist literary text from India to East Asia or Southeast Asia, we can find that there are beautiful instances of exchanges without hierarchy. So that is very important, that we can find in our medieval history also, we can find exchange without hierarchy. And that proves literary exchange does not necessarily create literary hierarchies. Therefore, René Wellek was against of influence studies, and he talked about to focus on literariness. Therefore, so that was a crisis, and that crisis means a paradigm shift. Therefore, a new shift, new paradigm was introduced in the discipline, and American school came into being. If you take example of Asian schools of comparative literature, Asian schools of, and the question of crisis in Asian schools of comparative literature is quite different. In 1998, if we take example of China, the Ministry of Education of China, they actually focused on comparative literature and world literature together. For them, world literature and comparative literature was not different. So they tried to connect the entire world with the methodologies of, I mean, the literature, representative literature of different countries of the world with the methodologies of comparative literature. Therefore, when 1998, the Ministry of Education of China, they published a general catalog of world literature, they actually merged these two disciplines, comparative literature and world literature, together. Therefore, China did not have such kind of crisis. If we talk about India, our crisis is different. We do not have methodological crisis. We do not have epistemological crisis when we talk about comparative literature in India, but our crisis is the discipline itself is marginalized, because there are very few manifestation of the discipline as academic unit in the country. So that is one problem in India, but the crisis is different. The crisis mostly was faced in European countries and America. When Susan Bassnett in the end of 1980s talked about the death of a discipline of comparative literature, she actually did not talk about comparative literature as a dead discipline, but she talked about a new paradigm, and that was translation studies. According to Susan Bassnett, comparative literature never can be survived without the intervention of translation studies, and comparative literature is actually a very systematic and methodological study of literary translation of text from across the globe, across the languages. And through translation, actually comparative literature transcends the boundary of language, class, nation, and all. So that was Susan Bassnett's position. When Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak talked about death of a discipline, and he pointed out another, she pointed out another different kind of crisis of comparative literature in American universities, or mainly in West in general. That was the literary studies. She proposed of area studies and to include the huge number of indigenous languages or other languages what are there in modern times in different parts of the globe, that most of the languages are ignored, literature of those languages are ignored. So we fail to imagine our world. And when we talk about our world, that world is not only Anglophone world or Francophone world or the Hindi Urdu world. There are worlds beyond all these linguistic imaginations. So Spivak focused on the languages and area studies. But whose area studies is this? For America, it is important. For any capitalist nation, it is very important to have area studies or regional studies. It is very good for globalization. It is very good effect of globalization that different parts of the world assumed as area or region, and their history, geography, culture, economics, literature, film, everything has been studied to have a better understanding of that particular area. But for Asian countries, the political context is quite different. It is not because of there are no capitalist country or such thing. It is for Asia, the reality is different. For America and for Europe, they colonized the different parts of the world, and they also have huge business to circulate, to extend in different parts of world. Therefore, area studies or regional studies is very important. But when we take example of China, they do not care about regional studies or area studies. In terms of comparative literature, they are imagining the world through comparative literature and world literature together. And interestingly, if we take example of Central Asia and South Asia, these two geopolitical spaces together have nearly the population of Europe. And if we take the example of East Asia and South Asia, these two geopolitical spaces have population twice than Europe. And therefore, the Central Asia, East Asia, South Asia all have more linguistic and cultural diversity and all. And we are yet to focus on these diversities. And we are yet to discover the literary exchanges what the Central Asia, East Asia, or South Asia once had. So because the comparative literature and its methodology are very much dominated by Europe and America. Whenever we talked about the crisis of the discipline, whenever we talked about the methodology of the discipline, we always borrow the methodology from European scholars or from American scholars. The problem happened because the Asian scholars do not have very good academic or very regular academic exchanges among them. Therefore, we failed to take the corpus of literary reception by China, by Japan, by Indonesia, by Papua New Guinea, by Hong Kong, by Singapore, and also by India, or Bangladesh, or different other South Asian countries, because we do not have very regular academic exchanges. If we see in the situation of comparative literature in India, Shishir Kumar Das, the doyen of the discipline, who used to taught in Delhi University, Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies. Now currently it is Indian Language and Literary Studies. So Shishir Kumar Das had beautiful definition, very thought-provoking definition he proposed, and that is very simple, that is methodologically also very clear. What was Shishir Kumar Das's argument? Shishir Kumar Das told that, he stated that our objective is literature, our methodology is comparative, and our context is India. Therefore, he assumed Indian literature as terra firma, as a ground for doing comparative studies, ground for doing comparative literature. So Indian literature is a terra firma. So if Indian literature is terra firma for comparative literary studies in India, there is no importance or no significance of area studies or regional studies whenever we are doing comparative literature in India. But one point of Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak is very important for the Indian comparatist, that is the importance of multiple languages what India speaks, or multiple languages what China, Africa speaks, Latin America speaks, or various Asian countries speaks. Therefore, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's attention was on global South. It is always assumed by the global comparatist that comparative India is very curious or interesting field of comparative literature because India has multiple cultures, multiple literatures and all. Therefore, India is very curious site for doing comparative literature. But area studies is not important for Indian comparatists, as India has a responsibility towards multiple languages and multiple cultures, and India by historically it is not that much interested, or by nature it is not a colonizers nations. So it is always colonized nation. So it is not colonizers nation, or it does not have very good extension of financial capital owned by Indian citizens in different other countries. So it is not like America. Therefore, the area studies is not very important or significant methodology or device for doing comparative literature in India. It is not as important as it is in America, or it is not as important as it is in various European nations. For Russia, for a long time, the people did not come to know about the methodology and the practice, the nature of practice of comparative literature. But East European countries, after the disintegration of Soviet Union, they started de-Sovietization of their literary practices. Therefore, they started connecting with the European nations more, and therefore East European countries, they build their comparative literature discipline with very nationalist idea. It is about their own nation, own language literature, and also borrowing the European elements into their literary studies. So that is very important and unique case studies for East European countries. Therefore, comparative literature in East European countries is quite different than other European schools of comparative literature, because East European countries, they started comparative literature with very important political motive, that is de-Sovietization of their literary studies and becoming more European. So therefore, the comparative literature in East European countries is very much connected with the idea of nationalism and the nation building and all. Recently, we started, I'm editing a book. The manuscript is almost ready. It is comparative literature in Asia, and the book will be published by Hong Kong University Press, and several Asian countries, comparatives from different Asian countries, almost to 22 countries, they have contributed in this book. There are two articles from India also, and one article from each Asian nation who practiced comparative literature. There are interviews of the comparatists and the comparative literature practitioners also. So we started working on this in 2023. And in 2023 November, I organized one workshop on comparative literature in Asia with Hong Kong University Comparative Literature department. And our intention was, I was coordinator for that workshop, and our intention was to reshape the discipline as an Asian school. Is there is there any possibility of creating Asian school of comparative literature? Because Asian reality is so different than the European reality or the American reality. But both are connected in some way or other as we talk about literature and the literary greatness. And in India also, comparative literature is very much connected with the phenomena of First World War, when in 1919, Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee for the first time introduced Indian Vernacular Languages Department in the University of Calcutta. His intention was to introduce comparative study, and in his convocation address in 1923, he talked very proudly that now let me talk about the discipline of Indian vernacular language, for which I am very much proud of, and we are very much successfully we are doing comparative studies of literature in this discipline. So and that discipline was established in 1919. So it was in the pretext of First World War. When René Wellek was talking about the crisis of comparative literature, it is the pretext of Second World War. When Susan Bassnett is talking about the crisis of comparative literature, it is a pretext of the fall of Berlin Wall and the disintegration of Soviet Union. And when Spivak was talking about the crisis in comparative literature and new paradigm shifting in comparative literature, it is again context of several wars what have been happening across the country, and it is a cumulative result of all the theoretical intervention what happened before Spivak's intervention in death of a discipline. Therefore, comparative literature always emerged, and the paradigm shift of comparative literature always happened during the situation of global conflict. That means comparative literature always tried to focus on cosmopolitan humanism. That cosmopolitan humanism was very favorite term for René Wellek also, and that cosmopolitan humanism is not much different than the idea of universal humanism what was proposed by Rabindranath Tagore again in the pretext of First World War, when in 1920s Tagore was traveling several European countries. Many of the European reporters, scholars, intellectuals, they were very much excited to meet Tagore. Even from, the reporters, they traveled from one European country to another European country following the date of travel of Tagore, because of one thing, that some person is coming from Asia, particularly from India, who has sage-like beard and the entire appearance. It's like the sage as described in the New Testament of Bible, and that fellow is talking about universal humanism. That idea of universal humanism was very important for entire European world, because it was just finished, or it was just got rid of the First World War, the devastating First World War, what brought all the question against modernity of human civilization. So universal humanism was very important in that context. And when René Wellek is talking about cosmopolitan humanism, and he connects comparative literature with the idea of cosmopolitan humanism in 1948, that is very important political and philosophical intervention. And in similar time, the University of Calcutta invited one scholar from Kabul University, Afghanistan. The name of the scholar was Rolf Henkel. And that Rolf Henkel, interestingly, René Wellek was Austrian scholar, and Rolf Henkel also was Austrian scholar. But one difference between René Wellek and Rolf Henkel is Rolf Henkel traveled all across the globe, in different parts of the globe. He brought up in China, in Japan, he taught in Afghanistan, he traveled India for a long time, and he died in Australia. When he was invited to deliver lecture between 1949 December to 1950 January at the University of Calcutta, he delivered consecutively 3 lectures on comparative literature, and Calcutta University published that book as Studies on Comparative Literature in 1952. That was the first book of comparative literature published from India, and that is not recorded anywhere in the history. I'm only sharing it in my lecture. Nowhere in no comparative literature book you can find the contribution of Rolf Henkel. This is the kind of ignorance we have towards the discipline, towards the literary studies since many decades. So Rolf Henkel is very important comparatist, because Rolf Henkel talked about history men. This idea of history men is also very important. Through this idea of history men, he talked about, actually he referred to Chakraborty Raja Gopalachari and his lectures in the parliament, and he told that perhaps he is the best comparatist one of the best comparatists of the world, because when he delivered lecture in parliament, he referred texts like Ramayana, Mahabharata, Iliad, Odyssey, Quran, Bible, and all the great human creation of this world, of this human civilization. And with the idea of a history man, Rolf Henkel actually argued that comparatists are history men, and comparatists are those persons who always transcend the border and inherit the idea of one universe in their mind. So those persons are history men. So it is not only about the comparatist, it is the very nature of comparative literature. Therefore, comparative literature is, René Wellek argued about cosmopolitan humanism, and Tagore talked about universal humanism. When Tagore talked about universal humanism, Tagore did not talk about universal humanism in the context of comparative literature, but literature and philosophy, in the context of literature and philosophy in general. And his Vishwashitya cannot be alienated from this idea of universal humanism, because when Tagore talked about Vishwashitya, that Vishwashitya, Tagore actually talked that what you call as comparative literature, I called as Bishwashitya. So this Vishwashitya is actually neither comparative literature nor world literature. Therefore, Satyendranath Tagore, when he translated, sorry, not Satyendranath Tagore, it is Tagore's nephew, I think, I forgot his name. Okay, so when he translated that Vishwashitya for Vishwabharati Quarterly, he translated Vishwashitya from English, from Bengali to English, not as world literature. This is very interesting. He put the title of the essay as universal literature. So Tagore's Vishwashitya was not comparative literature, not world literature, but it was universal literature. Why Tagore was talking about universal literature? Because Tagore actually was celebrating the idea of literature. He was continuously arguing the greatness of the literature, and that is literariness. That René Wellek later in 1948 and throughout his life, he was continuously arguing about this greatness of the literature. And when he was talking about this greatness of literature in the discipline of comparative literature, he was actually arguing to transcend all the borders, all the boundaries of literary creation, languages, nation, race, ethnicity, and all, and to celebrate the universalism, the cosmopolitan humanism, or the universal humanism, because that is the celebration of literature. And for them, for these people, if we borrow their philosophy, according to them, the literary studies, should not or cannot be diluted or occupied in the name of interdisciplinary studies, in the name of area studies, in the name of cultural studies, in the name of extra literary or non-literary affairs, but it should celebrate the greatness of literature itself. Because with that greatness of literature, we can create an world of universal humanism or cosmopolitan humanism, and that is again and again argued or put forward by many scholars, many philosophers, many comparatists. And only comparative literature can do that, because comparative literature has that greater mind or greater space to allow everyone, because there is no boundary. All other single literature disciplines have their own boundary of languages, of their regional politics, of their subnational identities, and all. But comparative literature is not responsible in all these issues of subnationalism or the regional politics or the politics of the concerned area and all. So comparative literature, when we talked about crisis, we actually talked about crisis of literary studies in general. And whenever we talked about crisis in comparative literature, it is about the paradigm shift. Therefore, crisis in comparative literature, crisis never used in comparative literature in negative sense. It is about a new paradigm shift. It is about turning a new move towards a new way. And throughout all these turning points or all these paradigm shifts, the objective is one single objective that is very, very clear by many comparatists and many philosophers who are associated with the literary studies like Tagore, like René Wellek or Rolf Henkel. It is universal humanism, or it is cosmopolitan humanism, or it is about the history men, and it is always about the greatness and beauty of the literature, what can be upholded through the comparative literary studies. Therefore, comparative literature is very important. Therefore, comparative literature can be assumed as an inclusive policy, because comparative literature can offer a space for multiple languages. Otherwise, we have only literary disciplines in India for 22 scheduled languages. We do not have any literary disciplines what can accommodate thousands of other languages, right? And Ashutosh Mukherjee's idea was to celebrate the polyphony, the plurivocal reality, the multilingualism of India. So that was Ashutosh Mukherjee's idea. And when the scholars of Calcutta University, they established the small academic trust called Calcutta Comparatist, they are actually trying to celebrate this multilingualism. And one great and unique thing they are doing, the Calcutta Comparatist 1919, is giving award for the translation in non-scheduled language. That never ever happened in India before. And Calcutta Comparatist 1919 introduced that in 2026. So that is about celebrating the multilingual reality, and that could be a new turn for comparative literature in India. And therefore we should not have or we should not feel responsibility towards a particular single language of the India, but for all the spoken languages of the India. So that should be the ethos. That is a kind of tune of universal humanism. Being an Indian, we can feel, or we can celebrate, and that is not some absurd idea or something which is not unachievable. Because Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee, Rabindranath Tagore, later in René Wellek and Rolf Henkel and many other comparators, and later also Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, they talked about this multilingual reality and celebrating this multilingualism. So what is the current objective, or what should be the current objective of comparative literature? The objective of comparative literature should act like an inclusive policy, inclusive site for accommodating literatures of many, languages of many, even beyond 22 scheduled languages. Though theoretically we have told it, we felt proud of it, that we have many languages and India is a curious site for doing comparative literature, but we never initiated it in practice. In all the comparative literature departments, or most of the comparative literature departments in India, they do comparative literature in all these selective languages from 22 scheduled languages. But there are languages and the literary worlds what should be accommodated in the discipline whenever we practice it in Global South. Therefore, for Global South, area studies is not much important. The important is multiple languages. And whenever we talk about universal humanism or cosmopolitan humanism through literary studies, that is about accommodating many languages and their literary worldview. Therefore, greatness of literature is important. Therefore, extra literary devices, extra literary affairs, non-literary devices, non-literary affairs are not much important to do comparative literature or literature in general in our world academia. Because whenever we talk about culture studies or interdisciplinary studies of literature, we actually tend to cross the boundary or the definition of the discipline of literature, and we tend to mix with sociology, with political science, with history and all. But we should remember all these disciplines are different disciplines. What literary a historian does, a sociologist done, a political theorist done, that cannot be done by our literary scholars, because literary scholars has much more greater responsibility to accommodate the wider linguistic population, linguistic varieties of this world. Therefore, whenever we talk about crisis, it is crisis in general, about the literary future, about the literary context. And whenever we talk about crisis, we actually talk about new paradigm shift. And today, also comparative literature and literary studies in general is in crisis, because we are moving more about area studies and interdisciplinary studies, but our focus should be as accommodating as to accommodate the linguistic varieties and the literary varieties of our nation and of the world. Uh, the neighboring nations and the world, languages of the world across. So this is briefly about my intervention on crisis in comparative literature, or how crisis actually complement the comparative literature disciplines in particular and literary studies in general. Here I stop, as it is a kind of workshop. So I would like to have some questions from the students who are here, so we can have further discussion for a few other minutes. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for this enriching session. We are now opening the floor for question. I request the participants to please be brief and relevant to the topic.
Yes, Anshika, you can unmute and address the question directly to the resource person.
Hello, sir. It was nice session. I have noticed one point that you were mentioning that mainly most of the department are doing comparative literature in few languages. As a scholar, I have tried to include languages other than the main list like Marathi, Tamil, Telugu. But situation is like that I am not able to find translation for the texts. Languages, those are not much in focus. Their translations are also not available. So what you will say about this?
Thank you that you tried to include, the text from all these languages. This is the problem, I know. I know this is the problem, and I also I thank the department where you are doing research, because that department allowed you to work on all these languages. So therefore, we need some policy changes. It is not about you who can do something, but we need certain policy changes for India, because we just lazily or in relaxed mode, we have passed many decades, and we observed the silent death of the languages, of the epistemology and all, and we have been following the same corpus of text all across the country. Whenever we talked about gender studies or women studies, everywhere in the country people actually deal with 5 to 10 text. Whenever we talked about Indian literature in English translation, those 5 to 10 text. Whenever people do research, PhD in different literature disciplines, people actually deal with mostly 10 to 15 text all across the country. So we, the literary scholars, actually travel between mostly 20 text all across the country. So all these are lazy, relaxed, and all this, the behavior we should change towards our literary studies. We cannot afford this luxury of being exclusive. It's the enough of doing that. So it is not you alone, but we need to change the policy.
Thank you, sir. This is very satisfying answer.
Thank you.
Yes,
Sir,
Monica.
there is a question in the chat box. Someone is asking, can you suggest a few good books which explain the field of comparative literature as methodology and that you explained in the session?
You read Susan Bassnett. That is very seminal book. You read in A Theory of Literature by René Wellek and Austin Warren. So these two books are very, very important. These two books are very seminal books. Also, Comparative Literature in India by Amyo Dev and Shishir Kumar Das. This book is very important. So these three books will help you a lot. Also, Ulrich Wittgenstein, that is also very important. Ulrich Wittgenstein, I think you can get soft copy in Google. So these four books, yeah, these are enough for knowing the methodologies. And once you are done with all these four books, then you read Death of a Discipline by Spivak.
Yes, Konika, you may raise a question.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, while dealing with Sanskrit epics in comparative literature, what important things we should keep in our mind?
Which epic, what you want to study, because epic is not a very small text, right? It has multi-dimensional text. So it depends what you want to study on epic, what you are looking for in the epic. So, and which epic? There are many epics in India. It is not only Ramayana, Mahabharata. There are many epics. So it depends on your research questions that what you should focus on.
Thank you, sir.
So is there anyone else? Participants are free to raise questions to the resource persons, Dr. Pramanick. Yes, Raj.
Someone, yeah.
So you mentioned extra literary and non-literary criteria for comparative analysis and whatnot. It's basically René Wellek's these are René Wellek's concepts. But if a work is actively engaging with political forces, I mean content-wise and both stylistically, then we would need to address the political sides as well. And the oftentimes what happens is that in our country, especially in the southern in global south, what happens is that political forces are much more intertwined with uh, firstly publishing history, secondly how they affect the narrative and how they are received by the public as well. So as a scholar, do you think we should address these things, or should we uh, limit ourselves, like René Wellek says, to do the literariness of the literature?
Yeah. This is very good question. No, extra literary and non-literary, these two issues, I talked about it. René Wellek didn't talk. René Wellek was talking about the literariness, that we should focus on literariness instead of the historical relativism, scientism, and the factualism. So whenever we will do literary studies, yeah, that is true. There are literatures which are very much associated with people's movement. There are literatures which are manifestation of the people's movements. So when we will deal with those literatures, there will be two different clear methodologies. One is the role of literature as organic creation, because these are the manifestation of the movement, or these are contextualized or appropriated in certain movement, in certain narratives. This is one part. Another part was that literariness of those literary texts. So that will help you to understand the how literariness, how the beauty of a literary text can be organic to manifest a people's movement, or also how a people's movement can create or able to create a creative beauty, which is literature. So there are two types of uh, approaches or two things what you can do in a literary text. So see, whenever René Wellek is talking about literariness, or whenever I am talking about non-literary or extra literary affairs, we are not telling that you cannot do study society, you cannot do study history, culture, or politics through literature. You can, you should. That actually proves the importance of literature in human civilization, that how literature can carry the memory of the community in a complete manner, that in carries the memory of some political movement, some historical movement, or some culture. You should talk about it, but your primary source is literature. So in your literature department or discipline, in the name of doing literature, you cannot do study only on meme, reel, or I mean the painting all the world or on the wall. There are art history department, there are painting department, there are film studies department for doing those things. I mean, you cannot do, or you cannot tell everything as literature. So if everything is literature, then literature is nothing, right? So René Wellek and other comparatists, when they are arguing for literariness, they are talking, or they are putting forward the importance of being literary. That importance is they are talking about. But it is not restricted that you cannot talk about politics, history, culture, or society in your literary research or in your literary studies, because literature carries the memory of every sphere of our existence, our belonging. So there are two different approaches.
Thank you, sir. Sorry for mixing up René Wellek's concept with yours, but as you
No,
said,
no,
it
no,
was
no, no.
entirely
It's
satisfying.
okay. It's okay. It's okay.
Yes, Divyanshu.
Good evening to all. Hello, sir. My question is about it is an abstract question that if we talk about Rami Malik's, oh, sorry, Rami Malik's interliterariness, I'm concerned if that the dominance of English language, it how does it shape interliterary relations and exchanges? Because I find it that a major proportion of globe is concerned or adopted English as their second language when we talk about American diaspora, Indian diaspora, or Southern Asia or Asian diaspora. So I'm concerned about it, how the dominance of a language affects interliterariness.
Actually, dominance of a language does not only affect the interliterariness, but it affects our literary studies in general, because we become very exclusive. It is not only about the English. I mean, nothing will happen blaming English, but it is about balancing and creating a kind of equal space. It is not about equal space also. It is a journey towards equal space or inclusive space, not equal space. It is about the inclusive space, what we should create for our literary studies to have an idea about the world we live within. So whenever we talk about English or imagine our literary studies or literary world with English or with Hindi or with Urdu, it is very, very much limited, biased, partial, and very much exclusive. Therefore, our literary methodology, our literary text, our literary study in general is very much biased, limited, and exclusive. So this is the problem.
So can I ask something? Okay, can I add
Yes,
something?
yes, yes, yes.
Yes, we have a problem issue with it, but can we say that it is a step in cosmopolitanism?
No, no. Whenever we talk about cosmopolitanism, the cosmopolitanism cannot be created with a single community or single language or single vision. Cosmopolitanism actually, therefore, René Wellek talking about cosmopolitan humanism that celebrates the diversity. Cosmopolitanism always celebrates the diversity. So if it cannot celebrate the diversity, it cannot, I mean, humanism in general, when Tagore talked about universal humanism, it is not through a single language or single culture or single nation or by representation of single nation, culture or language, but it is about the accommodation of many, accommodating variety, accommodating the diversity.
Very clarifying. Thank you.
Okay, is that it? Is there any other question? Okay, Mukta.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for the very enlightening session. Thank you, Dr. Sebastian, for holding on this session. So actually, I'm currently working with Rajasthani folk songs. And while I understand the language, I do not exactly have the formal training in translation. And I want to know if in such cases, how should we approach the translation of oral traditions and oral texts and these folk songs, especially when their performative and cultural aspects may not fully carry over?
This is very important and challenging part of your research, and that will be strongest part of your research also. So there are several books. I mean, you can see works by Anita Appi, published by Sahitya Akademi, works by A.K. Ramanujan. Also, there is another book of Indian folk tales. It is by Ramkumar Mukhopadhyay and translated by translation edited by Sanjukta Dasgupta, published by Sahitya Akademi. So you can see all these books. These books will help you directly. And also there is one collection of Rajasthani folktales by Nyogi books. That is a translation. So you can see that book also, the kind of methodology they are using or the way they are dealing with the oral text while they are documenting it and also translating it. So these books, I mean, especially the introduction of the translators and editors will help you. This is very challenging thing, and this is the strongest part of your work also. But you have to be very careful. You yourself is documenting all these Rajasthani folk tales, or it is already documented?
So those are actually folk songs. I'm documenting these songs.
You are documenting. You yourself is documenting.
Yes, sir. For now, I have decided to document them. I have other sources also, but I'll also be personally visiting Rajasthan.
Okay, okay. So whenever you are documenting all these things, you have to be very careful because it is very crucial ethnographic study, right? So you are also living in Rajasthan. I mean, you speak Rajasthani.
Yes, I'm half Rajasthani. My mother is from
Okay.
Rajasthan.
Okay, okay. So it is kind of ethnographic research for you. So you have to be careful about ethnographic research because whenever we document, we tend to shift the things according to our convenience. So that has to be very carefully dealt with. And for documentation, one problem happened that is during the process of documentation. Because if you do not have very good command over the culture and language of the certain geocultural area or geopolitical area, the documentation can be, I mean, there may be some fault or something. So therefore, you have to be very careful whenever you are doing this ethnographic study. But yeah, otherwise you have available sources.
And in spite of having no formal knowledge or the training in translation, I can translate these songs on my own.
For translators training, Central Institute of Indian Languages offer 21 days long translation training program throughout the year. So you can join that program. That will help you.
Okay.
Central Institute of Indian Languages, Mysore.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Just one word of appreciation from my side. Dr. Pramanick, that was a very thought-provoking taught,
Thank you,
and I'm so
madam. Thank you.
have benefited a lot. It has
Thank you,
broadened their
madam.
horizons, and the thrust on literariness and universalism is really
Thank
something
you.
which needs to be dealt with
Thank you,
seriously.
madam. Thank you so much, madam. Thank you so much.
So I think we can take just one or two questions and then conclude, isn't it, sir?
Yes, yes, yes.
That's a
Yes.
question from Deepak. Yes, Deepak.
A very vibrant good evening to one and all present in the session. I am
Good
Deepak,
evening.
a PhD student at the Punjab University, Chandigarh. So my question is, I suppose anthropologically, we all human beings have this innate attribution of comparing each and everything. Whatever comes to our mind deliberately or inadvertently, we compare it all. But most of the time, we are more inclined to superiorize one entity
Mm,
against the
mm,
other. So,
mm,
as a
mm,
comparativist, how do
mm,
we isolate ourselves from this
mm,
preconceived,
mm,
elusive notion
mm,
of being biased towards a particular
mm,
entity? Do we have a
mm,
pragmatical solution for it, sir?
mm. Deepak, this is very, very important question. Thank you for this question. Deepak, whenever we talk about comparative literature, the problem is with nomenclature. I mean, when we talk comparative literature, it is not about comparing two or three literatures. But the word comparative is used slightly in different way here. Whenever we talk about comparative literature, it is about the existence of many exchanges among many. It is not about the comparing. Comparison is very, very old method in our literature, in our social life. Everywhere we used to compare. When we were in school days, our parents used to compare us with neighbors' children, right? So whenever we talk about comparative literature, it is not about comparison. It is not about comparing one with another. Right. And therefore, the problem is there with influence studies. Influence studies create hierarchy, the kind of hierarchy you mentioned also in your question. When we compare between two or three, it creates a hierarchy. It makes someone superior. But when we talk about comparative literature, it is not about comparing. It is when we the comparative in comparative literature is accommodating the differences, accommodating the varieties, because when we talk comparative, that is comparative in a sense that we are not accommodating single, but we are accommodating many. We are not comparing between two or three, but we are valuing the exchanges among two and three. We are not establishing superiority or inferiority, but we are talking about the kind of appreciation one did towards other, right? So in that sense, comparative is used in comparative literature. It is no longer, or it is no way connected with the idea of comparison or comparing, but comparative is accommodating more, comparatively more you are accommodating. Comparatively, you are talking about exchanges other than influences or other than superiority, inferiority, or these things. So, yeah, this is often taken, it is often confusing. People get confused, but the comparative is no longer connected with comparing with two, three. Okay.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable response.
So thank you very much. It was such a very insightful and comprehensive discussion that we had. So as you were talking about comparative literature, its different concepts, and also the different movements in different parts of the world, the different schools like the American school and the French school and the Russian school. It was like traveling through different spaces and different times to make us understand the different moments of crisis that led to the progress of comparative literature. And throughout the session and throughout the discussions, we were again and again emphasizing upon the basic concepts of comparative literature, which are inclusivity, going beyond borders. And while addressing the crisis of comparative literature, we do that by being self-critical. which is the most important for any discipline. And that is exactly the reason why comparative literature has a discipline has so much significance. And all the questions that were raised by the students indicates how relevant and insightful the lecture turned out to be and how thought-provoking it was for them. And I feel very glad that most of these questions were raised by our comparative literature students who have taken so much MA comparative literature students who have taken it as an elective. So that way, the delivery of your lecture as well as the discussions have actually met the purpose of the workshop. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much, Aloysius, and I'm very, very happy that student asked so many questions, and all these questions are very relevant and important questions. So I can feel that how sincere and serious they are towards comparative literature. Thank you all. Thank you,
Thank you.
Aloysius. Yeah,
So
and
now
thank you to the department.
thank you. So now I invite Raj to deliver the official vote of thanks. Raj.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of our department, I'd like to take a bit of your time and a bit of your attention uh, to thank everyone who made today's workshop such a valuable experience. First, I'd like to extend a warm thank you to our Honorable Vice Chancellor. Uh, she may be otherwise engaged today, but she is the patron of this workshop, and her support for these initiatives makes a huge difference to our learning. And I'll come back to our esteemed speaker today, Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanick. Thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and delivering such an expansive perspective today at length and taking our questions with grace. And because I'm only a master's student, so my knowledge of comparative literature and my brush with the literary studies has been very short. However, this was a very illuminating session for me because I would take a few specifics to uh, to extend my gratitude. That I would like to focus on a few specifics to extend my gratitude. I loved how you were sort of globe and talking about cross pollination of European comparative concepts and how uh, Russia's political foot is in the literary theory and how the Henkel's idea of comparative literature, comparatists as historymen and everything. It was a very impassioned session, and I really wish you the best. You talked about your initiative to sort of reshape this discipline to into an Asian school, which I hope to see, and you all hope to see. And I take away from this lecture that the usual literariness, the importance of usual literariness, but also the accommodation of, you talked about accommodation of linguistic varieties and vernaculars and everything. Your presence has been nothing short of welcoming and a wonderful company. So it has been a privilege to hear you speak. And I would quickly move on to our head of department and chairperson, Professor Indrani Mukherjee. Thank you, ma'am, for making this workshop possible and your continued encouragement. We hope that uh, that more workshops would be organized in the wake of this. And thank you, Dr. Aloysius Sebastian, our coordinator. He has been working very hard behind the scenes to make all these things possible. And his efforts ensured that it ran smoothly and on time. And it was truly appreciated. Thanks for all the participants for being here and actively engaging with the session. Uh, it was an enriching experience for me, and I hope it was an enriching experience for you all as well. And thank you all. Thank you.
Aloysius, you are muted.
Sorry. Yeah, yes. Now I'm audible, I think. So, Mrinmoy sir, thank you so much. So, I'm very glad that I'm able to listen to him again after those days when I used to be a student during my MA days. And it's good to have you back. It reminds me of our days in Hyderabad. And thanks to all the participants and especially all those students who have helped with organizing this workshop. And
Thank you. Thank you
the
so
team.
much. And
Yeah. Thank you,
And
sir.
congratulations, Aloysius. I wish all the best for the next lectures, and I think students will be very, very much benefited. And it is really very good contribution to the discipline. Thank you,
Sure,
Aloysius.
sir.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm taking leave.
Sure, sir.
Okay, okay, bye.
We will end the meeting here.